We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 16th of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up.
Obviously, we're in a very difficult spot right now, and we hope that we can find the steps forward that provide for the end of this war in a negotiated way and the prevention of any war in the future.
After being a no-show in Turkey for direct peace talks, what exactly is Putin's Ukraine strategy now? Polish presidential candidates enter the final 48 hours of campaigning. And newly re-elected Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese heads to Indonesia. Then,
it needs its own identity, which is connected to the host country in an ideal world, and that's what we did in a way.
With the surviving acts preparing for tomorrow's Eurovision final, we look at what makes a great host. Plus the day's papers and the latest luxury news too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said the United States is troubled by the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza after at least 114 Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Thursday. The United Arab Emirates and the United States have signed an agreement to build the largest artificial intelligence campus outside the US in the UAE. And LA28 organisers have announced an ambitious plan to fly Olympic spectators across the notoriously gridlocked city using air taxis. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories, but first, to the surprise of probably no one, Vladimir Putin is not waking up in Istanbul after a long day and night of direct talks with President Zelensky and Trump on a peace plan for Ukraine. Zelensky, who after urging from Trump committed to attending, says it's proof that Russia is not serious about real talks, given Putin would only send, quote, stand-in props. So with Trump, who, let's never forget, said he'd resolve the conflict on day one back in office, getting increasingly frustrated with the Kremlin, what exactly is the game they're playing? Well, I'm joined now by Russia analyst Stephen Diel. Stephen, thank you for coming on again. Was Putin ever going to go to these talks?
No, in one word. He announced, of course, on Sunday that talks would take place, and everyone had the impression that this meant that he was serious and would go, and certainly that's what Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, thought. But it seems that what Putin decided was that he was going back 3 years in time, because basically the composition of the delegation that he sent to Istanbul is, if not exactly the same people, but the same positions. Vladimir Medinsky, his not exactly number two. Putin doesn't have a number two, but someone who's close to Putin. He led a delegation then, and there was a deputy defense minister, deputy foreign minister. And it's almost as if Putin is pretending that what's happened in the last 3.5 years, or nearly, hasn't happened in the war. He wants to go back to talks that put Ukraine in its place, that say to Ukraine, you're not going to get Crimea back. You've got to give up the territory that we've taken so far. You must give up any idea of joining NATO or indeed being a proper sovereign country. And it's a kind of time warp for Putin.
And is this just simply denial, or is this a sort of larger strategy at foot? Is this sort of magical thinking that he can, will this into existence?
It is the sort of magical thinking. He feels that the position of the war, of course, what he's ignoring is that he hasn't achieved the aims he had at the start of the war. At the start of the war, the aim was to take over the whole of Ukraine. If we look back, and this tends to be forgotten, not on Monaco, I hasten to add, but tends to be forgotten in a lot of the comments, that Putin attacked Ukraine from the north, from Crimea, from the east, from Russia itself. Putin's aim was to take over the whole of Ukraine. His aim was quickly to seize Kiev, to either probably assassinate Zelensky, certainly remove him, put in a puppet government, and control the whole of Ukraine. And because it hasn't gone that way, that's rather been put on the back burner. But that is still Putin's intention. He got very bad intelligence at the start. He thought he could do this very quickly, within 3 days, if not a week. And it didn't happen. So now he's got to try and present to the Russian people that some kind of victory is still happening and is still possible in the long run. And that's why he has this strategy to do this, but is ignoring this. And whatever President Trump says, he really doesn't feature in Putin's thinking on this issue.
Well, Donald Trump has obviously been far harder on President Zelensky. We all remember that Oval Office disaster. But is there a risk, though, for Putin that Trump's patience might get exhausted if he, doesn't get this deal that he promised?
Well, I mean, who knows what's going to happen with Trump and what Trump is going to say next? That for Putin is as much of an enigma as for the rest of us. Trump puts across this idea that he and Putin can talk man to man. And that they will come to some deal, one of Trump's favourite words, of course. But as Trump knows no better than Putin exactly how their relationship is going to pan out. And Putin is not frightened by Trump saying, we'll up more sanctions and so on. Russia is not just muddling through. Russia's not doing too badly at the moment. And of course, Putin has, in terms of his own population, has put the whole Ukraine war to them as, this is as existential for Russia's existence that we've got to keep doing this. And so I'm afraid when Mr. Trump turns around and says, Putin and I have got to get together and talk and then we'll sort it out. That's not how Putin sees it at all. Putin can drag this out for a long time yet. And he's really not, he can play the game that Trump wants, but he is way ahead of Trump in this game. Trump, I think, just doesn't get it, to be honest.
The Russian economy is, though, under strain. There's sort of rising cost of groceries and inflation. We saw the big fanfare of the Victory Day parade last week, but they are, of course, having manpower recruitment issues. Is there a danger that things could get out of Putin's hands? And sometimes these things can collapse quicker than anyone would have expected. If you look at the end of the USSR, the end of Syria, I mean, is there anything that sort of says maybe he's getting over his skis a bit?
Vincent, I would say you've hit the nail on the head. This is the one area, this is the one thing, and I know I've said this on Monocle many times before, but I have no hesitation in repeating it. The one thing that frightens Putin most of all is not the United States, is not NATO, or is not anything outside the country. It is the threat of a spontaneous uprising from below. And as you quite rightly say, as living costs increase, and if people en masse are sparked into some sort of demonstration, riot, whatever, as you mentioned, I mean, for example, Syria was a very good example. Who expected last December for suddenly Syria to be overturned in a week after a war lasting many years? And that is the fear for Putin, that if, in fact, public opinion snaps, if there is something like prices going way too high, the cost of living going up, that people feel they can't cope, and there's some sort of demonstration, uprising, riot, that is the one thing I feel in the immediate future that could crack and could cause a real change in Russia. And if there's a real change in Russia, then that brings the war to an end. Because if they've got to control their own people, if they've got to turn the tanks on their own people, which I'm not hesitating to say they would do in crucial circumstances, because Putin will do anything to stay in power and stay alive, then that is the one thing that really could change this. And people can keep talking in Istanbul, and Trump can keep sounding off in America or on a plane or wherever he happens to be. But for the time being, that fear of bunt, as the Russians call it, this uprising from below, is the one thing in the back of Putin's mind that really keeps him worried.
Mm. He will, though, feel somewhat emboldened that on the Victory Day parade, I mean, in 2022, shortly after the invasion, no world leaders turned up. I think last year it was 9. This year it was 27, according to the Kremlin. I mean, there is a sort of thawing of the isolation that they had. Is that something that's bolstering Putin, that he's sort of showcasing to the Russian people?
Oh, undoubtedly. Yes, that looks good to him. And as you say, the way the numbers have gone up with each year, the way he can play up the apparent friendship with China. I say apparent friendship because Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. And at the moment, China's playing along with the game. The fact that Xi went to Moscow for the parade was a big boost for Putin. So this is, and he really plays this up to his own people. Look, never mind the West. We're pals with China. I have no hesitation in thinking either that China, were it to come to this, could drop Russia very quickly, and that would be a serious blow for Putin. But yes, the idea that. Telling his people that we have this existential threat, so we've got to keep going. But also, look, the rest of the world is not against us. We have some great friends around the world. That all helps paint the picture that Russia can still cope with all this.
And just finally, we have seen talks between sort of officials from the Trump administration and Vladimir Putin, but no direct talks yet between the two presidents. Do you think that could be imminent in the summer, and what would those be like?
I think it'll depend on how the war is going. I think it'll depend more on Putin than Trump. Trump can say he wants it all or whatever he wants, as many times as he wants. But if Putin doesn't actually agree to it, if we get another scenario like this week where we thought that Putin would be setting up to speak to Zelensky in Istanbul, and then it turns out the delegation is completely different, and Putin's saying, I never had any intention, or his people are saying he never had any intention of going. That's not what we said in the first place. The Kremlin will string people along on this one. And at the moment, I don't think it's actually Putin's that bothered about meeting Trump. It might come to a point where he thinks, yeah, okay, this would be a good propaganda coup. But I think it depends on Putin more than on Trump.
Stephen Dalziel, thank you very much. This is The Globalist. It is 8:12 in Warsaw, 7:12 here in London. And we head to Poland now, where the final stretch of campaigning is underway before presidential elections on Sunday. There will be a runoff, 100%, but the debate is getting heated. There are accusations of secret services meddling in the election, and the Law and Justice Party is likely preparing the ground for an attempt to nullify the result. I'm joined by Mateusz Mazzini, writer-at-large at Gazeta Wyborcza and lecturer in journalism at Collegium Civitas, now from Warsaw. Mateusz, thank you for joining us. Who are the main players in this election, and how has the campaigning gone?
Morning, thanks for having me. So I think there's a lot to unpack here as we're embarking on the final stretch of the campaign. A very tiring campaign, a very complex campaign, and I think most of the people that were covering it will be very happy to see it come to an end. The polls are suggesting that the frontrunner, the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, who is the governmental candidate, the centre-right liberal former government minister, former European Parliament member, will likely win the first round on Sunday with around 32-33% of the overall support, which is a comfortable leading position, but nowhere near as much as he and his campaign team were hoping for even 2 or 3 months ago. I think the ambition here was to get around 37, perhaps even in the 40s before the runoff. Right behind him is Karol Nawrocki, who is a curious candidate because initially he was labeled as the civic candidate. So as opposed to being affiliated with any political party, he tried to build himself as a voice of the people, if I may, even though it was clear and it was obvious that he was being launched with the backing of Law and Justice, the former nationalist populist party that was in power in Poland for 8 years. That label, that play didn't really yield any particular results. So around a month ago, 5 to 6 weeks ago, perhaps, Law and Justice entirely shifted the tone. The leaders of Law and Justice, former cabinet ministers, the outgoing president, Andrzej Duda, who is a Law and Justice politician, went on record to say that Nawrocki is actually their candidate to try to rally the troops of the party electorate behind his candidacy still in the first round. There are many other interesting candidates in the backdrop of this. Some of them are pro-governmental, they represent other minor coalition partners to Civic Platform. The left has as many as 3 different candidates. There's a number of fringe personas also running for presidency, but in the longer term, none of them will matter because the runoff is almost secured to be between Trzaskowski and Nawrocki.
And what are the key issues in this election for Polish people?
Well, I think the main line of division lies along the preferences of the government. So basically, the result of the runoff in 2 weeks' time will depend on whether Trzaskowski will manage to turn the second run of the presidential ballot into a referendum against Law and Justice. So basically, the argument of the government is we have been in power for a year and a half, but we didn't get much done because we have had a doorstopper in the presidential palace in Andrzej Duda, who was vetoing all the main law and legislation proposals. If you vote Law and Justice out of the presidential palace, if you vote Trzaskowski in, then the way is clear for us to deliver on key issues like abortion, perhaps even same-sex marriage, strengthening of the position of Poland within the European and NATO context, because obviously security is on everybody's minds and everybody's mouths these days, given the still existing Russian imperialist aggression and an ever more likely threat of a direct invasion into a NATO country, perhaps even Poland. On the other hand, Nawrocki will also try to make the second round of the presidential vote a referendum, but a referendum on the government. So the rhetoric here is actually quite simple. He's trying to communicate a message to his own voters that under the 8 years of Law and Justice, life was better. Economic performance was much more significant, which is not entirely true, but that is actually the message. And if you vote Nawrocki, meaning if you stay with Law and Justice in the presidential palace, there will probably be snap elections, and the right, in coalition with far right, will return to power also in parliament.
And in terms of the sort of disinformation and misinformation that is ever present in elections now, what has that been like in this campaign?
So there's a lot to unpack here, and actually this is a very worrying ground because not just in the cybersphere, not just in social media, we see a lot of electoral interference or attempts to influence the result of elections from the outside of the country. So obviously there is a very good number of fake accounts on TikTok, X. These are the 2 most notorious platforms that are known for disinformation. And we know for a fact there are heaps of research, and even the Polish National Cybersecurity Agency is sounding the alarm bells that there are a lot of paid, unverified election spots and advertising elements on the social media that seems to be coming from Russia. But we have a way more visible attempts of to influence the outcome of these results. Just 3 days ago, George Simeon, the leading presidential candidate in Romania, the far-right extremist who is openly pro-Russian and anti-European, visited a campaign rally of Karol Nawrocki, the Law and Justice candidate, backing him up. Nawrocki himself took a picture with Donald Trump in the Oval Office some time ago. There is a number of different American think tank members, intellectuals loosely connected to the MAGA base and heritage foundations and all these organizations that form the intellectual backbone of the MAGA movement, who are known to be advising to some of the elements of the Polish right. They're known to be traveling here. And there are major worries, and I know that for a fact, especially within the governmental spaces, that the American administration will try to influence the outcome of these elections, not just by backing one of the candidates, which they already did effectively, but also by meddling in campaign strategies and offering some sort of spin doctor services, if you please.
Yeah, and reports that they're trying to bring J.D. Vance in between the two rounds. I mean, they've obviously not checked his recent track record of a Pope dying and India almost going to war after a visit. You yourself, though, have been moderating a high-profile event this week in Poznan. Tell us about that.
So I'm freshly off Impact CE in Poznan, which is a major business conference with a side of politics. I think this is the most apt description for this event, with a lot of different high-profile guests. So I was moderating a panel on future of Europe, and I'm not entirely sure you can discuss all the issues connected to the future of Europe in the span of 30 minutes, but we came up with Ivan Voivoda, Sylvie Kaufmann, Lieke Vries, all major European intellectuals, with some solutions how to listen to angered and isolated and frustrated European voters. But obviously, the big act of Impact CE was Barack Obama, who came to Poland, interviewed on stage by Professor Timothy Snyder, so two heavyweights discussing the future of democracy. And Obama didn't really have many concrete receipts and many concrete pieces of advice on how to get out of this democratic deadlock. But he sounded some alarming bells by saying that democracy cannot further isolate many parts of the electorate, which is to be read as a message, especially, I think, to the German people, that AfD, if the Merz government decides to ban it, will not solve the problem, because it isn't AfD that is the problem. It's several million adult Germans voting for that party, which is openly xenophobic and openly nationalistic. And the other thing that Obama said that I think was striking also for the Polish audience was that liberals all over the world, but especially in America, have to go through a time of reckoning, and they really have to come to terms with the fact that there were a lot of mistakes in identity politics. Identity politics went way too far, and even Obama seems to be agreeing with this. And without that reckoning, there is no moving forward, but also one has to remain hopeful, because the key thing in moving forward is to have a hopeful plan for the future.
Matthias Mazzini, thank you very much. Still to come on the programme.
We learned quite a lot about both the top flight speed and the lack of respect for traffic laws of the mallard.
Well, it is this week's Andrew Muller's What We Learned. Do stay tuned for that. This is The Globalist. The papers are next.
IQ, EQ, and AI. Three components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Claudine Fry, partner at Control Risks. Claudine, welcome to the show. First of all, South Korea has caught your eye.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me. Yeah, that's right. This is a piece from the Japan Times reporting on a meeting of trade ministers, APEC, trade ministers who are meeting in southern Korea. They've been there today and yesterday. It's the first major meeting of trade ministers for this group since Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs, and of course the reversal of those then a couple of days later, in a region which is possibly the worst hit by the intensified trade war that we've seen unfolding over the last few months. So it's been very closely watched, partly to see how the region and the various participants in this meeting, how they're engaging with each other, and the extent to which they're prioritising attempting to negotiate with the US and do a deal with the US bilaterally versus trying to actually revive the APEC organisation itself and club together perhaps to sort of give a new lease of life to multilateralism and to revive other trading relationships in an attempt to sort of manage the consequences of the way that the US is pursuing its trade policy.
And we've seen a sort of interesting shift where, Japan, South Korea, China, not countries that normally align well, have been doing so in the face of these tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're going to see some really interesting realignments. We're definitely going to be seeing some sort of supply chains readjusting, some trading relationships readjusting, new impetus behind trade talks that have been dormant or slow moving for a long time. Of course, we've seen that already with the UK and India suddenly progressing towards a trade deal, and the US and the UK as well. And yes, South Korea and Japan in a particularly difficult situation because they need to balance the US, which still provides important security support to them both, with the need to manage the consequences of a much more brutal trade policy for them both out of the US, but also simultaneously try to balance the need to keep China on side as well.
Turning now to America, and its new immigration policies are having an effect potentially on scientific discovery.
Yeah, this is a piece which provides one of those examples of a very specific example of how changes to the way that American government institutions are functioning and resourced is going to play out with very real consequences for many millions of people. It's reporting on the National Institutes for Health within the US, which is the world's biggest funder of medical research. It's going to stop awarding grants to scientists if the projects involve making a payment, which is called a subaward, to a foreign collaborator. So as you can imagine, there are many medical research projects underway within the United States which involve working with partner organisations, different universities, for example, right around the world. So this is going to have huge consequences for many pieces of research looking at all sorts of illnesses and disease such as malaria and HIV, as the piece mentions, also chronic conditions such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia. It will still be possible for foreign organisations to access funding from the NIH, but it will have to do so by applying directly for that funding rather than getting it from the American research partners that they're working with. And the experts in the piece quote a number of different concerns about this new policy, not least the fact that it's impossible to do some of their research without working easily with foreign partners, but also about the fact that it's not really clear what's going to replace the old policy and whether the new system will work. And of course, that is very reminiscent of other things, other aspects of the changes that we've seen taking place to the way that American government institutions function and are resourced, i.e. changes being made very quickly and radically.
And Prime Minister Keir Starmer was in Albania yesterday, but down the road in Westminster, from where we are sitting in the studio now, there's trouble brewing on his backbenches.
Indeed. This is a piece in the FT reporting on a rebellion that appears to be building within the Labour Party ahead of a vote that's coming up on a welfare bill, which essentially proposes some quite significant cuts to various types of welfare payment that are made here in the UK, and particularly to people with, disabilities. This is seen as being, as the headline in the piece says, not what Labour stands for. And so it does appear to be the biggest test that Prime Minister Keir Starmer has faced so far domestically. He's had a bit of a boost recently from the fact that growth in the UK from January to March was better than anticipated.
Now the highest in the G7.
Indeed. And he's done, I think people mostly accept that he's done reasonably well managing Trump as well. But there are lots of problems brewing. And of course, this rebellion comes just after local election results here in the UK, which were bruising for the Labour government, and also suggested that the Nigel Farage Party Reform UK is on the rise.
And finally, Harvard has cashed in. They spent about $27 in 1946 on what was thought to be a copy of the Magna Carta, but it's a real one.
Yeah, that's right. Some good news here for Harvard. This piece has been reported in a number of different newspapers. And yes, indeed, a couple of academics from the UK, one of whom was doing some research online of the Harvard Law School library, trawling through some statute books and discovered that he was actually looking at a real version of the Magna Carta, one of just 7 that were issued in 1300 by Edward I. These academics made a lot of painstaking efforts to work out whether it was indeed original, and we're excited to discover that it was. This document, of course, being the foundation stone of Western tradition of law and democracy. And so it's a particularly notable time, I think, to find it, given the pressures that democracy are on at the moment. It, of course, asserts, as one of the academics involved, Nicholas Vincent, who's a professor of medieval history at the University of East Anglia, as he says, the Magna Carta asserts a fundamental principle that the ruler is subject to the law.
Yeah, very timely. It's interesting because in some ways the Magna Carta sort of holds a higher place in the culture in the United States than sometimes it does here in the UK. And to have got this and sort of not realise what you had. I mean, at one point in World War II, I'm right in saying, I think, that Winston Churchill was even offering potentially to give America a Magna Carta to try and draw it into the war. I mean, that's how valuable a document this is in America.
That's fascinating. And ironically, that's almost what happened, because in the end it was sold for such a small amount of money into the Harvard Library.
Well, Claudine Fry, thank you very much. Here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said the US is troubled by the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza after at least 114 Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Thursday. Gaza has been under a complete Israeli blockade of all food and other supplies for 10 weeks. The United Arab Emirates and the United States have signed an agreement to build the largest artificial intelligence campus outside the US in the UAE. The agreement is a major win for the country, which has been trying to balance its relations with longtime ally the United States and its largest trading partner, China. And LA 28 Games organisers have announced an ambitious plan to fly Olympic spectators across the notoriously gridlocked city using air taxis. The air taxis would offer 10 to 20-minute flights between select destinations, including several of the largest venues in the region. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It is 13:32 in Jakarta, 7:32 here in London. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met with Indonesian President Prabowo in Jakarta this Thursday to discuss defence cooperation, trade relations and regional security issues. During the talks, Australia pledged support for Indonesia's bid to join the CPTPP trade agreement and the OECD. Well, I'm joined now by Hanga Thathana, Assistant Professor at the Department of International Relations at Islamic University of Indonesia. Thank you for joining us. What's the significance and background of the Australian Prime Minister's repeatedly choosing Indonesia as their first overseas destination?
Well, this has become something of a diplomatic tradition in recent decades, and it's deeply meaningful. When an Australian Prime Minister chooses Indonesia as their first stop, it signals that they see the relationship not just as an improvement, but also as a foundational. It reflects also a recognition that Indonesia is Australia's closest large neighbor, the biggest democracy in Southeast Asia, and a key player in shaping the regional order. In a way, I think it's an act of respect and also a signal to both domestic and international audiences that Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular matters to Australia's future.
And how important is this relationship between the two countries in terms of shared security and economic prospects?
It's critically important. Both countries are anchors in the Indo-Pacific, Australia to the south, Indonesia at the heart of ASEAN. And on security, we share concerns over maritime security, transnational crime, and also regional stability. On economics, there is real potential still being untapped. The Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement laid a foundation, but there is scope for much deeper cooperation in energy transition, in digital infrastructure, food security, and also education. And I think in a world shifting geopolitics, having strong, predictable partnership between two middle powers is, of course, essential for regional balance.
And how important is Australia's support for getting into the CPTPP and the OECD?
Australia's support for Indonesia's entry into the CPTPP and OECD isn't just about helping a friend. In my view, it's about investing in the rules-based regional order. By backing Indonesia, Australia positions itself as a country that supports the rise of its neighbors rather than trying to contain them. And that builds strong and also long-term strategic trust. For Indonesia, I think it's also a pathway to reform and to align with high-standard international frameworks. And for Australia, of course, it deepens the influence and credibility, not through coercion, but through the cooperation.
And in terms of how Indonesia perceives the balance between its relationship with Australia, but also deepening relations with others, particularly China and Russia, how does it play that?
I think it's quite important in terms of Indonesia and Australia relations in of the China's rising. I think we share the same values that we're going to see the shared rule-based order. Indonesia foreign policy is independent and free active policy. Australia deploys what they call as the strategic equilibrium. And we see that the rivalry between China and United States influence in the region should be ruled on the basis of what we call as a rule-based order, which we think it's very important.
Hanga Fathana, thank you very much. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, final preparations are underway in Basel for tomorrow night's grand finale of the Eurovision Song Contest. German production designer Florian Wieder knows a thing or two about Eurovision staging. Basel is his 9th Eurovision. Florian has staged everything from Adele's concerts in Munich last year to WrestleMania in the United States. With Swiss roots himself, Florian used Swiss mountains and the country's language diversity for inspiration while designing the Eurovision stage. Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco spoke with him in Basel and began by asking him to share the 3 key design elements of the stage this year.
There are actually 3 kind of key design elements from a creative point of view. There's, when I started working on the show, there's one design element which is Karl Gerstner's Swiss grid, which comes from the graphic world, and then within this grid, actually almost everything can happen, and I thought this has to be part of the design, and we have to incorporate it somehow. So we turn it into a 3-dimensional grid, but it's invisible. It lives behind the screen, and it can be visible in certain moments. And we turn it into a grid with an active surface. Quite interesting toy to play with. And the second thing is, I thought what makes Switzerland so special is the 4 different languages. And I was looking for something that stands for these 4 languages. So that's how we came up with this frame. So the 4 sides of this letterbox frame, so this stands for the 4 different languages here. And then the mountains is probably the most obvious one because the other 2 got to be explained. And the mountains is that's the part of the creative that is easy to read.
And the letterbox frame, that's quite unusual. I think that's the element of the staging that I was quite surprised because of it. It's huge.
Yeah, it is massive. And to be honest, So it also has a purpose. It's not only a design purpose, it also has a functional purpose. The issue with this venue, which I think works really, really well, also in terms of scale and size, looks great on TV, but there's one big issue that you can't hang anything from the ceiling. And on a show like this, you need lighting and tons of other stuff and toys that need to be hung from the ceiling. We knew that there's a massive ground-supported truss structure needed to make this work, and we tried to hide this as good as possible. So the upstage legs are actually behind the grid and the screen, so you can't see them at all. But then we still had the remaining 2 legs somewhere in the middle of the room, and I was looking for something to play with. And to be honest, we had these 2 legs, and then we came up with the idea of the frame to incorporate these 2 massive truss legs. And this is why it's in the middle of the room, but I think it works pretty well. So we turned
it's grandiose.
Exactly. We turned it into a functional design piece. Yeah. So this is why there is this frame, not only for design reasons, but it's interesting because it multi-layers the room in a very interesting way, and you can use it in different directions. So you can shoot it dead center with the screen in the background and the main stage, and then the frame itself also has a stage, so you can also perform within the frame. And then if you shoot in the other direction, you can still use the frame as a kind of letterbox, and you have the green room in the background.
And a question to you, Florian. I mean, I was talking to Martin Osterdahl earlier this year. I mean, the challenge, because you have 26 artists in the final. How to do that? I mean, there must be so much planning before.
Well, you know, the basics, or the 26 countries or individual countries are actually not the challenging part. So what the show needs, or there are 2 things that a show or a Eurovision stage actually, or a set in general, needs, which is it needs its own identity, which is connected to the host country in an ideal world, and that's what we did in a way. But this identity has to be really, really strong, because you always go back to this kind of, let's call it generic look, which is important. And then, of course, you have all the individual performances. And in an ideal world, each performance is completely different. That's at least the goal. But most of the creative, when it comes to the performances and the performance looks, is coming from the delegations. So you have to come up with something that inspires them, and it has to be an ideal platform, ideally not very limiting. So the more they can do with it, the better it is. And of course, when we came up with this concept, we already presented them a couple of different ways how the stage can be used, and I was honestly so surprised, because there is so much, and they're doing stuff I haven't even thought about. So it's great. So it's a good year.
And the artists, you know, they have sometimes those massive props. Do you have, maybe not you personally, but you have to say a lot of no's to the artists, you know?
I mean, before they start thinking about props, they usually getting like a deck with information saying, okay, the prop can't be bigger than whatever, like 2.5 meters high, 4 whatever meters long, could be like 2 or 3 pieces. So most of the stuff has to be divided, because we have to funnel this or all the props through like a slightly lower area, and it's usually the lowest door that counts. So it has to fit through certain areas to make this work.
That was Monocle's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco reporting from Eurovision 2025 in Basel. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio for more from Fernando throughout the weekend. This is The Globalist.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS. Banking is our craft.
now it's time for Andrew Muller's own Eurovision Heavy What We Learned This Week.
We learned this week, and once again, of the reliable facility of the Eurovision Song Contest for conjuring diplomatic incidents about which not one sane person cares in the slightest. Or do they?
Oh, phew.
Thank God for that.
I, for one, very much care about this
leave
kind
now
of thing, and I'm definitely not mental.
Well, fair enough. We learned that this year's iteration of the Pan-Continental Warbling Tournament, which will be all over for another glorious year as of Sunday,
Yay!
had occasioned hostilities between Italy and Estonia. We learned that the cause of this diplomatic spat, possibly indeed even a stramash gusting full-blown brouhaha, was this.
Ciao Bella, I'm Tommaso, addicted to tobacco. Me like me coffee, very importante.
That being Estonia's 2025 submission, Espresso Macchiato by Tommy Cash. No relation, so far as we have been able to discern, to Johnny, June Carter or Roseanne. We learned upon reluctant scrutiny of the lyrics that Italy, the aggrieved party in this instance, aside from, music lovers or people with serviceable ears generally, may actually have a case, as the lyrics can be fairly said to have applied the Italian stereotypes with a somewhat heavy hand on the trowel.
I work around the clock, that's why I'm sweating like a mafioso. Life is like spaghetti, it's hard until you make it.
We learned that among the Italian politicians who had perceived mileage in pretending to be enraged by this drivel was Gianmarco Centinaio, Vice President of the Senate, who thundered thus, as will now be intoned with due menace by Monocle's Inane Vendettas desk chief, Chiara Ramella.
Whoever insults Italy must stay out of Eurovision.
We learned, however, that as of the first semi-final on Tuesday, this was a minority opinion, as Estonia's jabbering nonsense won through to Saturday's final, where bookmakers confidently expect them not to win. Although we learned upon scrutiny of the odds that bookmakers do reckon that this, from Sweden, might win, and to be honest, it's not notably worse. Been a while since we've had a Eurovision winner with an accordion, and on which subject? What should you throw to a drowning accordionist? Their accordion. Perusing the semi-final results further, however, we learned of the folly of the fate-tempting song title, in this instance deployed by Slovenia, specifically
How much time do we have left together?
none, it turned out. Sticking, however, with the subject of continental oddballs beclowning themselves while attempting to rouse the pride of their nation, it would appear to be Accordion Week, which, who knows, might yet become a national holiday in Germany if certain excitable yahoos get their way. Regular listeners to these weekly news reviews may recall that late 2022 or so, we met tweed-jacketed minor aristocrat Heinrich XIII and several co-conspirators who were rolled up by German plod on charges of plotting to re-establish the German Empire as it was from 1871 to 1918. And sure, why not? It went pretty well for at least 43 of those 47 years. We learned, however, of another bunch of hapless bozos seized with similar ambitions, which, we learned, unaccountably given the intellectual firepower animating the scheme, had also been thwarted.
Aww.
We learned that the ringleaders of Clue in the Name Kingdom of Germany, which, like pretty much everything else, sounds more ominous in the original German, i.e. Königreich Deutschland, had gotten their outfit banned and their collars felt. Among the arrestees, their putative monarch, Peter Fitzek, or Peter I, to his acolytes, whose as yet incomplete ascent to the German throne has included stints as a New Age bookseller and karate instructor, and given the luck he is having as a royalty restorationist, probably wise he has options to fall back on.
I think so.
Persisting with the motif of adventures in Mittel European law enforcement, cue the Alphorns. We learned quite a lot about both the top flight speed and the lack of respect for traffic laws of the mallard. Yes, we learned this from police in the central Swiss settlement of Könitz, who, 1, may not be overstretched, and 2, released images of said wild duck caught by traffic cameras in the small hours, proceeding at a clip reckoned at not less than 52 kilometers per hour in what is, as the road signage makes abundantly clear, a 30 kilometer per hour zone. It gets worse. Könitz's finest believe, or at least have been willing to speculate in order to attract attention on social media, that the creature is a repeat offender, a similar-looking bird having been photographed in exactly the same spot, doing roughly the same speed in 2018. Verily, those night shifts at the Könitz cop shop in the intervening 7 years must have absolutely whooshed by. At the very real risk of appearing humorless, however, it is little wonder in the footage that no people are visible on the streets, which, were it not for fear of the duck, would surely be like the streets of every other Swiss town after dark, i.e. a riot of colour, music, dance and breezy good vibes to rival Rio in Carnival Week. For what we mostly learn is that the clearly terrified burghers of Könitz are being sorely let down by law enforcement, in that the duck remains clearly at large, police having failed after all this time to...
Oh no.
Quack the case.
Boo.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, it's time for a roundup of luxury news, and for that we're joined here in the studio by Brenda Toohey, Monocle's luxury markets editor. Brenda, great to have you back on air. First of all, Penhaligon's 155th anniversary.
Yes, it's a very, very special time for them. And they have a beautiful exhibition showing all of their perfume and scent archives in Hanover Square that's open to the public from tomorrow. William Penhaligon opened his barbershop in Jermyn Street 155 years ago. And I mean, he was quite a firebrand, really. His barbershop was next door to a Turkish bath. And, expanding his empire into scent, he created his first scent, and it was called Hammam Bouquet, the scent of the Turkish bath.
Probably wafting down the streets, yeah. And they've had a bit of an expansion in recent years, haven't they? A real revival.
They certainly have. They remain quintessentially British, but they certainly look to other territories, to other countries, and to the royal family, actually, for some of their scents.
They were a favourite of the late Duke of Edinburgh, weren't they? The Queen's husband, for anyone, Prince Philip, who's seen The Crown, or, yeah.
Absolutely. And they have a collaboration with Highgrove called Highgrove Bouquet, which is beautiful. And they have a new scent coming out in June, which is under wraps for the moment. But Winston Churchill famously wore Blenheim, which is an outstanding scent. Yeah, and they're going strong. They're fantastic.
It's a hard store because they've got so many scents. It's hard to sort of narrow down which is your favourite in there. Another anniversary, Liberty, not quite as old, but 150.
I know, it's wonderful, isn't it? In that beautiful mock Tudor shop that they built in 1924. I think they were around the corner previously. They have a wonderful fabric exhibition going on the 4th floor, which again is open to the public until I think the 24th of July. And it has different thematic chapters, Genesis, nature, people, and DNA. And it really goes through all of their archives. I mean, walking through it is sort of like walking back in time. I remember many of the fabrics. You know, you think, oh my goodness, I used to have cushions like that. Or, oh, I think when I was a child we had those curtains. So it's wonderful to look at the designs by Sonia Delany or William Morris, of course, famously. And that's there. It's open to the public. It's very interesting. Also, on a couple of floors down, you can look over the balcony. There is a wonderful structure, like a house made out of patchwork quilt pieces. There are 1,500 pieces. I believe that Jill Sander and Paul Smith created a piece, but the pieces were created everywhere from Macclesfield to Melbourne. Mm. And there are photographs by Uli Weber as well, portraits of many of the people who work in the store. And it's quite fantastic, too.
Because I have an aunt who's into sewing patchwork quilts, and she lives all the way in Australia, but she was back, I think, last year, and she made a beeline to go to Liberty because you can ask for sort of cut-offs of any of the material, and they'll give it to someone if you're a sewer yourself, and you can use them to make something. So that's a really good anniversary exhibition for people that love Liberty. And finally, closer to home, Confect. It's not quite as old. It's a young thing, but you've got a summer edition coming out.
We have. That'll be out on the 5th of June, and it will show us some wonderful fashion shot in Cairo. It will update us on what summer wines to drink.
Is it rosé heavy?
I just can't say. And also some fantastic residences to drool over. In Europe and beyond, and as usual, excellent writing. Thoughtful, considerate opinions. We have our essay section at the back. We even have an essay from an astronaut, which is quite exciting as well.
It's not Katy Perry, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay, good. And just finally, for anyone who hasn't picked up a copy of Confect before but are used to sort of getting Monocle from the newsstands, what is the difference with Confect? What's the sort of USP?
Well, it's a quarterly magazine, so it can take a very deep look into whatever the subject matter is. And it's very, very dense, about 290 pages.
It's a thick book.
It's a thick book. Yeah. It's large format, fabulous photography. It's really geared towards women, I would say, but, not exclusively. Mm-hmm. And it's entertaining, it's travel, residences, fashion.
Perfect summer companion, then.
Absolutely.
Well, Brenda Toohey, thank you very much for joining us here on The Globalist. That's all for today's programme. Thank you to our producers, Anita Riota and Chris Chermak, our researcher, Francesca Giltz, and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Jack Dewars. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday London time. The Globalist returns at the same time on Monday. I'm Vincent McAviney. Thank you for tuning in.